Maribel Hartwell slammed her father's death certificate flat on Judge Caldwell's bench so hard, the whole courtroom went silent. "My father died on the 12th of March, she said, her voice cutting through that room like a blade. "Your contract is dated the 15th, 3 days after he was in the ground. So before this court rules on anything, I want somebody in this room to explain to me how a dead man signs his name." Judge Caldwell stared at her. The railroad's lawyer stopped breathing. And every person in that courtroom understood in that single moment that something had just changed in Red Hollow, Colorado, that could never be changed back. If you have ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, and accept what powerful men decided for you, this story is for you. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what Maribel Hartwell did inside that courtroom didn't just save her family's land, it brought down an empire. Subscribe to our channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below. Tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The men came before sunrise. Clara Hartwell heard them first, the creak of wagon wheels on the frozen road, the heavy knock against the front door. 3 deliberate strikes that didn't ask permission and weren't meant to. She was already up sitting in the kitchen in her robe with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink, staring at nothing in particular, the way she'd been doing most mornings since Thomas died. 14 months of mornings like that. 14 months of waking up and reaching for something that wasn't there anymore. She didn't move when she heard the knock. She heard her daughter's feet on the floor above, the creak of the stairs. And she thought not for the first time that Maribel moved through this house the same way Thomas used to deliberate, unhurried, like a person who had already decided how they were going to meet whatever came through that door. Maribel appeared in the kitchen doorway, still buttoning her collar. "Don't," Clara said. "Mama. Don't open it. If you don't open it, they can't say we received notice. They can't. They'll just come back tomorrow with a sheriff," Maribel said quietly. "And then we'll have less time than we have right now." Clara pressed her lips together. She had no argument for that because it was true, and both of them knew it. Maribel opened the door. There were 2 men on the porch. The one in front was thin, with a leather satchel under his arm, and the careful expression of a man who delivered bad news for a living, and had made his peace with it. The one behind him was bigger, and didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a reason not to argue with the lawyer. "Miss Hartwell," the thin man said. He tipped his hat. "Gerald Marsh, legal representative, Western Valley Railroad Company." He reached into his satchel and produced a folded document. "I believe correspondence has already been sent to your household regarding the property claim. I'm here to confirm the hearing date. Friday morning, 9 o'clock, Judge Caldwell's courtroom. If the estate fails to appear with licensed legal representation, the court will enter a default judgment in favor of the company, and this property will be vacated within 48 hours of the ruling." He held the document out. Maribel didn't take it. "My father didn't sell this land," she said. Marsh's expression didn't flicker. "The deed transfer on file with the county clerk indicates otherwise." "The deed transfer on file with the county clerk is dated the 15th of March, 1883, Maribel said. "My father died on the 12th. He was buried on the 14th. I have the death record, the doctor's statement, and the burial record from Pastor Webb to confirm all of that." Something shifted behind Marsh's eyes. Not guilt. Something faster than guilt. Recalculation. "Be that as it may," he said carefully, "the legal record as it currently stands is forged," Maribel said. The word sat between them on the cold morning air. The big man behind Marsh straightened slightly. Marsh tilted his head. "Miss Hartwell," he said with the patient tone of someone who had been trained to remain patient, making accusations of that nature without— "I'll be making them in court," she said. "Friday, 9 o'clock. She reached out and took the document from his hand. "Good morning, Mr. Marsh." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a long moment, listening to the sound of their boots retreating across the porch, the groan of the wagon, the hooves moving away down the frozen road. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the door behind her and breathed through it in slow, out slow, the way her father had taught her, until they stopped. Clara was standing in the kitchen doorway staring at her. "You just told a railroad lawyer their document is forged," she said. "It is forged." "Maribel." Her mother's voice cracked at the edges. "We don't have a lawyer. Mr. Fenwick sent word 3 days ago. He's not taking the case." "I know. Nobody in this county is going to take this case. The railroad owns half these men and has documents on the other half. We have no one." "We have me," Maribel said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. "You can't argue this yourself," Clara said. "You're not—" "Not what?" Maribel said. Not sharp, not angry, just steady. "Not a lawyer, no. Not educated. Papa made sure that wasn't true. I've been reading his law books for 3 years, Mama. Property law, contract law, evidence procedure, court rules. I know what they have to prove. I know what I have to prove to counter it. I know the weakness in their document, and I know how to put it in front of a judge." "Caldwell," Clara said. Just the name. Like that said everything. "Yes," Maribel said. "Caldwell." Another silence. "Then what?" "Then I walk in there, and I make him see it," Maribel said. "I make everyone in that room see it. And I make it so impossible to ignore that he has no choice." Clara looked at her daughter for a long time. This girl, this woman who had her father's eyes and her father's jaw, and something behind them that was entirely her own. Something that had been growing quietly for years, while the world looked at her size and her plain clothes and her soft voice and assumed she had nothing inside her worth worrying about. "All right," Clara said finally, barely above a whisper. "All right. Then let's get to work." They worked through the night. Maribel spread every document they owned across the kitchen table: deed records, tax receipts. Her father's correspondence with the county land office, livestock contracts, a bank agreement from 1879, 6 different papers bearing Thomas Hartwell's genuine signature across 10 years of his life. She laid the railroad's forged contract beside them. Even to an untrained eye, the difference was there. Her father had a particular way of writing his T, the crossbar pressed heavy on the left side, lifting as it moved right. The signature on the railroad's document had the crossbar running level straight across. Small difference. Exact difference. The kind of thing a man forging another man's name didn't think to notice. "Look at this," she said. And Clara leaned over the table and looked, and for the first time in 14 months, something came into Clara's face that wasn't grief. It was fury. Quiet and cold and absolute. "They sat across from your father at his own kitchen table," Clara said. "Thomas invited them in. He fed them coffee. He listened to their offer, and he said no. He said this land was for you, for after we were gone." Her voice dropped very low. "And they waited until he was in the ground. They thought there was nobody left to fight," Maribel said. Clara straightened up, lifted her chin. "They were wrong," she said. Red Hollow was not a wicked town. It was a frontier town, and there was a difference, not always, but sometimes. Most of the people who lived there had come west with whatever they could carry, and built lives out of dry ground and hard seasons, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit. They were good people, a fair number of them. Practical people. People who had learned which direction the power in this county ran, and who had learned not to stand in front of it. The power in Red Hollow ran through Judge Everett Caldwell, who was 58 years old and had held the circuit court bench for 15 years. Before that, he'd spent 3 years as a legal advisor for the Western Valley Railroad years that most people in town either didn't know about or had decided not to think too carefully about. He was a large man with iron gray hair and a way of sitting in his chair that made it look less like a judge's bench and more like a throne. He had ruled on land disputes, water rights cases, property claims. In 15 years, he had never once ruled against the railroad. Families had stood before him, hoping for justice, and walked away with nothing. Most of them had left the valley entirely after that. It was simpler than staying somewhere that had already decided you didn't matter. By Friday morning, word had spread all the way through Red Hollow. The Hartwell girl was going to argue her own case. The courtroom filled up before 9 o'clock. People who hadn't been to a hearing in years found reasons to be there. Men who worked for the railroad came and sat in the back rows with their arms crossed. Wives of wealthy ranch owners took seats near the middle and put their heads together and spoke in low voices. A few of the ordinary townspeople, shopkeepers, a blacksmith, a woman who ran the boarding house on Crane Street, sat near the walls and watched the door. They were waiting to see what a woman like Maribel Hartwell looked like when she failed. Most of them expected it to be quick. Harrison Vale was already at the plaintiff's table when Maribel walked in. He was the railroad's lawyer, blonde hair, going silver at the temples. A jacket that cost more than most families in this valley spent on food in a month, and the particular ease of a man who has never seriously lost. He didn't look up when she entered the room. He was reading through his papers with the calm focus of someone who considers the outcome already settled and is simply organizing the details of confirmation. Maribel walked to the defendant's table. She wore her mother's good blue dress. She was a heavy-set woman, broad-shouldered and solid-built from years of working a real ranch in real weather, and she carried that body with a straightness that some people in the room registered, and some didn't. She set her father's leather notebook on the table. She set her folder of documents beside it. She pulled out the chair and sat down with her hands folded in front of her and looked straight ahead at the empty bench. Walter Grayson settled into the chair beside her. He was 71 years old, 23 years retired from county law work, and the only person in Red Hollow who had offered her anything beyond sympathy. Not her lawyer, he was careful to make that clear because he wasn't licensed, and this proceeding required care. But he knew courtrooms the way old soldiers know battlefields, and he'd spent the past 4 evenings sitting across from Maribel at her kitchen table, going over everything she planned to say. "How are you feeling?" he said under his breath. "Like I might lose my breakfast," she said quietly. "Good," he said. "Means you're paying attention." She almost smiled. Judge Caldwell entered at precisely 9 o'clock. The bailiff called the room to order. The crowd settled into a particular kind of silence, the silence of people who have come to watch something happen and are now watching it begin. Caldwell took his seat. He adjusted his robe. He looked out over the courtroom with the unhurried expression of a man for whom this room has always been exactly what it is, his. Then he found Maribel. He looked at her the way men look at things they have already decided about. The blue dress, the leather notebook, the folder. He took her in for a moment, and something moved behind his eyes, something brief and quickly smoothed over, and then he looked down at the papers in front of him. This hearing concerns the property claim filed by Western Valley Railroad against the estate of the late Thomas Hartwell. He said, his voice filling the room with practiced authority. The plaintiff is represented by Harrison Vale of Vale and Associates. The defendant, a pause deliberate waited, appears to be representing herself. A ripple through the crowd. Someone in the back made a low sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's correct, Your Honor," Maribel said. She kept her voice steady. "Maribel Hartwell, representing the estate of Thomas Hartwell and the interests of Clara Hartwell, surviving spouse." Caldwell looked at her over the bench. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and his tone shifted, something almost gentle entering it, the particular gentleness of a man who is about to be condescending and has dressed it up as concern. "This court doesn't typically accommodate unlicensed representation. These proceedings are complex. Are you quite certain you wish to?" "I am, Your Honor." "It would be in your family's best interest to seek proper—" "I've sought it, Your Honor," she said. "No licensed attorney in this county would take the case. I am what my family has. With respect, I'd like to proceed." The room was very still. Caldwell studied her for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair with an expression that was almost amused, the specific amusement of a man who has decided that this will be over quickly and might as well be entertaining while it lasts. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Vale, you may present." Harrison Vale delivered his opening with the smooth efficiency of a man who has given the same speech many times in different rooms. The railroad had entered a purchase agreement with Thomas Hartwell. The agreement was properly executed and documented. The signature was witnessed. The property had been surveyed and valued. The estate had received appropriate consideration, the transfer was legal, and the court was respectfully requested to confirm it and order the current occupants to vacate. He sat down. 7 minutes. Clean as a blade. The crowd settled back. A few people exchanged glances. In the back row, one of the railroad men uncrossed his arms like a man who expects to be leaving soon. Maribel stood up. She was aware of the room. She was aware of 200 eyes on her, assessing, measuring, already deciding. She did not let any of that awareness show on her face. She opened her folder. "Your Honor," she said, "the defense requests permission to enter 3 documents into evidence. First, the official death record of Thomas Allen Hartwell filed with the county clerk on March 14, 1883, certifying his death on March 12, 1883, at approximately 6 in the morning. She walked it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the bench. Caldwell took the paper. He looked at it, and there it was. Not anger, not dismissal, not the calculated patience of a man waiting to overrule. Something quicker, something more fundamental there, and gone in under a second there, and gone so fast that anyone who hadn't been watching for it would have missed it entirely. Fear. He already knew what was on that paper before he read a word of it. Maribel filed the second document. The sworn statement of Dr. Emmett Pryor, attending physician, confirming the date and time of Thomas Hartwell's death. She walked the third to the bailiff without pausing. The burial record from Shepherd Methodist Church, signed by Pastor Aldous Webb, confirming interment on March 14, 1883. She turned back to face the bench. "Your Honor, the purchase agreement presented by Western Valley Railroad is dated March 15, 1883. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. 3 days after my father died. 1 day after he was in the ground. She let the room hold that for a full breath. "I would like someone to explain to this court how a dead man signs a contract." The courtroom erupted. Not with noise. Exactly. With something underneath noise. A collective shift. The sound of a room full of people recalculating simultaneously. Men who had come in certain were no longer certain. Women who had come to watch a foregone conclusion were watching something else. In the back row, the railroad men were no longer relaxed. Harrison Vale was on his feet. "Your Honor, the dating discrepancy can be explained by—" "Sit down, Mr. Vale." Caldwell's voice came out harder than he intended, and he knew it. Maribel could see it in the slight tightening of his jaw. "You'll have opportunity to respond. Miss Hartwell, continue." She continued. She introduced the signature comparison. 6 documents bearing her father's genuine hand against the railroad's forged contract, and walked them to the bailiff one by one with the calm, unhurried pace of someone who has rehearsed this moment until it lives in her bones. She kept her voice level. She kept her hands steady. She did not let the size of the room or the weight of the watching enter her body. Inside, she was shaking. She had been shaking since she stood up. She did not let anyone see it. When she sat down, Walter Grayson leaned slightly toward her. "The room changed," he said so low only she could hear it. "I know," she said. "Don't let it make you comfortable." "I won't." Harrison Vale's response was precise. A clerical error in the recording of the date, not uncommon in frontier county offices. The signature difference attributable to illness. Thomas Hartwell had been unwell for weeks before his death, and illness affects a man's handwriting. He introduced a clerk from the county records office, a man named Dobbins, with careful eyes and careful answers, who testified in a steady, quiet voice that the document had been filed in proper order, received in proper sequence, processed according to standard procedure. Caldwell's rulings during the cross-examinations were measured. Exact. Consistently pointed in one direction, Maribel noticed. She noticed the way he sustained Vale's objections and the particular grounds he chose. She noticed the way he framed his overrulings of her own, always with the language of proper procedure, always just inside the line of justifiable. Howe was very good at this. He had been doing it for 15 years, and he knew exactly how far you could lean before the lean became obvious. But she had gotten one of the witnesses to admit he had not personally witnessed the document's signing. She had gotten the other to acknowledge the county office kept no intake log for submissions. Small cracks. Not yet enough. She knew it wasn't yet enough. She sat with that knowledge through the rest of the morning session and held herself still inside it. During the noon recess. Walter walked with her to the bench on the east side of the courthouse, and they sat together while the town moved past on the street around them. A woman Maribel recognized from church looked at her and then looked deliberately away. Two men in railroad employ walked by close enough that she could hear one of them say something to the other that made the other one laugh. She kept her eyes on the street. Caldwell knew, Walter said. Yes. Before he looked at the death certificate, he already knew about the date. Someone told him I'd found it, Maribel said. Someone who knew I was looking. Walter was quiet for a moment. You should know Caldwell didn't come to this bench clean. Before the appointment, 3 years with the Western Valley Railroad as their legal advisor. Approved land transfers across the territory. He paused. This isn't only about your father's land, Maribel. It's bigger. I think there are other families. How many? 3 I can speak to directly, maybe more. He looked at the street. They lost their land the same way. Clean legal documents, proper court process, Caldwell on the bench. All of them gone within 2 years. He turned to look at her. You're not just fighting a fraudulent contract, you're fighting the whole system he built. Then I need what built it, she said. The original survey. Before they filed the contract, someone measured that land. Railroad surveyor. He'd have the original records, what the land was worth, who gave the order, what the real plan was. Walter was quiet. You know who it was, she said. Man named Samuel Whitaker, Walter said slowly. Did survey work for the railroad for 8 years near as I know. Retired 2 years back. Moved somewhere out past the valley. I don't know exactly where. Can you find him? I can try. He stood up, brushed something from his jacket, looked down at her with the particular expression of a man who has seen a great deal of the world and is recalibrating what he thought he knew about some of it. Maribel. If Caldwell is as deep in this as the pattern suggests, this hearing is only the surface. You understand that? I understand it. There are other ways they come at people, ways that don't happen in courtrooms. I understand that too, she said. He studied her face for a moment. Then he put his hat back on. All right, he said. I'll find Whitaker. The afternoon session was harder. Vale had spent the recess sharpening. He came back with a second witness, another man from the records office, and built a careful, methodical case for the document's legitimacy routine. Process. Standard filing. Nothing irregular. Nothing unusual. Usual, just business conducted in the ordinary way of things. He spoke for 40 minutes and did it without raising his voice once. That was the most dangerous kind of testimony. The kind that didn't sound like testimony at all. Caldwell let it run long, and then, late in the afternoon, when the light through the windows had gone yellow and the crowd had begun to shift in their seats, Caldwell set down his pen, folded his hands on the bench, and looked directly at Maribel. Miss Hartwell, he said, and something in his tone was different now. Lower, almost conversational, like a man who has decided something and is ready to say it. The room quieted. I want to acknowledge, Caldwell said, that you have demonstrated considerable effort in preparing your family's position. The pause before effort was deliberate. She heard it land on effort the way a boot comes down on something soft. But I think we both know that effort, however admirable, does not substitute for evidence sufficient to override a properly documented legal transaction. He let that sit. The court will resume Monday morning for closing arguments. In the meantime, I'd suggest you use the weekend to consider whether continued pursuit of this claim is in your family's genuine interest. Another pause. Sometimes the wisest thing a person can do is recognize when a fight is already decided. The railroad men in the back row relaxed. Maribel stood up. With respect, Your Honor, she said, and her voice came out quiet and exact. I don't believe this fight is decided. I believe the court has not yet seen all of the relevant evidence, and I intend to present it Monday morning. Caldwell looked at her. And then something happened that nobody in the room was expecting. He smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who has been playing a game for a long time and has just decided to end the pretense of playing it. Miss Hartwell, he said, you are a determined woman. I'll grant you that. He looked out at the room, the packed benches, the railroad men, the wealthy ranch owners, the watching faces, and then back at her. "Tell you what, since you seem so confident in your position." His voice was almost pleasant, almost warm. "If you can produce evidence sufficient to overturn this claim, genuine irrefutable evidence that this court cannot dismiss, I will resign from this bench." The room went absolutely still. "Your Honor," Vale started. "I'm serious," Caldwell said, not looking at him. His eyes stayed on Maribel. "I've been on this bench 15 years. I know what a winning case looks like. What you have presented today does not look like one." He leaned forward slightly. "So I'll make it formal. Win this case, truly win it, evidence and all, and I'll walk away from this bench and never return. Lose, and your mother and you will be off this land by sundown Monday." He settled back. "Do we have an understanding?" Every head in the room turned toward Maribel. She heard the crowd. She heard the low murmur of voices, the shift of bodies, the particular sound of a room that has just seen someone handed a trap and is waiting to watch them step into it. She looked at Judge Everett Caldwell. She thought about the fear she'd seen in his eyes when he held her father's death certificate. She thought about the families Walter had described, 3 she knew of, maybe more, who had stood in this same room and walked out with nothing. She thought about the note she would find under her door in the morning. She thought about her father sitting across from her at the kitchen table when she was 13 years old, his finger running under a line of property law text. His voice low and patient, saying, "The law protects the person who knows it, Maribel. That's why they don't want everyone to know it." She thought about all of that in the space of about 4 seconds. Then she said, "I accept, Your Honor." Caldwell blinked. Just once. Quick. He had expected her to hesitate. "Very well," he said. He picked up his gavel. "Court is adjourned until Monday 9 o'clock. The gavel came down, and in the noise that filled the courtroom, the voices, the movement, the railroad men turning to each other, the crowd murmuring. Harrison Vale's tight expression as he gathered his papers. Walter Grayson leaned close to Maribel's ear. "He thinks he just buried you," Walter said. She was already writing in her father's notebook. She didn't look up. "I know what he thinks," she said. "Go find Whitaker." She walked home alone in the early evening cold. She didn't let herself feel the weight of what had just happened until she was out of sight of the courthouse around the corner, past the edge of town on the road that ran between bare winter fields toward the ranch. Then she stopped walking and stood still in the cold for a moment, with her face turned up toward the darkening sky. 15 years of stolen land. Families gone from the valley. A judge who had built a system so solid that no lawyer in this county would stand against it. A judge who was so certain of his own protection that he had just made her a public bet because he thought it would humiliate her. She lowered her head. He had no idea what she was going to find. She started walking again. Clara had supper on the table when she came in. She didn't ask how it went. She looked at Maribel's face and read what she needed to read there. "Sit down," she said. Maribel sat. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup Clara set in front of her and let the warmth move up through her palms, and she closed her eyes for just a moment. "He made me a bet," she said. Clara was quiet. "In open court, in front of everyone. He said if I win, he'll resign from the bench." Clara set her own cup down very carefully. "And if you lose?" "We're off the land by sundown Monday." The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. "Then you won't lose," Clara said. Maribel opened her eyes and looked at her mother across the table. This woman who had loved Thomas Hartwell for 29 years and had spent the last 14 months learning how to carry that love as memory instead of presence. This woman who had said "all right, baby" in the dark kitchen before sunrise and rolled up her sleeves. "I need to find the original survey documents," Maribel said. "The records from before the railroad filed their claim. Whoever measured that land, whoever gave the order, that's the thread that unravels the whole thing. Walter. He's looking for the surveyor, man named Whitaker. If Whitaker will talk." "If," Clara said. "If." Maribel agreed. They sat with that word between them for a moment. "Your father used to say," Clara began and then stopped, pressed her hand flat on the table, started again. He used to say that a fraudulent document is like a bad weld on a gate hinge. Looks solid until you find the one point where it isn't, and then the whole thing comes apart. She looked at her daughter steadily. Find the weld. I'm looking, Maribel said. The note was under the door when she came down the next morning. No envelope, no name. 3 words in heavy dark ink on a folded piece of paper. Leave it alone. She stood in the cold hallway and read it twice, folded it, tucked it into the front of her father's notebook, between 2 pages of property law notes she'd been reading until past midnight. They wouldn't threaten a woman who was losing. They threatened women who were getting close. She put on her coat and her boots and walked out into the morning cold to meet Walter Grayson at the edge of town because he had sent word the night before. He had found Samuel Whitaker. And Samuel Whitaker had something to say. Samuel Whitaker lived 11 miles outside Red Hollow in a house that wasn't much more than 4 walls and a roof. And when Walter Grayson knocked on his door that morning, the old surveyor opened it with the look of a man who had been expecting this knock for 2 years and had spent 2 years hoping it would never come. How was 64 years old, lean and weathered with hands that shook slightly when they weren't holding anything. He looked at Walter first, then at Maribel, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere between the two. I figured somebody would come eventually, he said. Then you know why we're here, Maribel said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. Come in, he said, both of you, and close that door tight. They sat at his kitchen table, the 3 of them, and Whitaker poured coffee with those shaking hands and set the cups down without looking at either of them. He stared at his own cup for a long moment, the kind of silence that has something buried under it. Thomas Hartwell, he said finally. Not a question. Yes, Maribel said. I knew your father. Whitaker wrapped both hands around his cup. Not well. Met him twice when I was doing the survey work on the eastern boundary of his property. He was a fair man, decent, offered me water and wouldn't hear of me refusing it. He stopped. I'm sorry about what happened to him. Tell me what you know, Maribel said. Whitaker looked up at her then, looked at her the way people look at someone when they're deciding how much truth that person can carry. All of it, she said quietly. Whatever it is, I can carry it. He let out a long breath. I surveyed the Hartwell property in January of 1883, he said. Routine work, I thought. The railroad was doing preliminary boundary assessments on several parcels in the valley. That's how it always started. Routine, they called it. Just measuring, just numbers. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. But the measurements I was given to use weren't right. The boundaries I was told to record weren't the actual boundaries. Someone had adjusted the survey instructions before they reached me. Added acreage the railroad didn't have a legitimate claim to. Made the Hartwell parcel look bigger, more valuable on the official record than it actually was. Who gave you the adjusted instructions? Walter said. Whitaker's jaw tightened. They came through this railroad's regional office, but the authorization signature on the instruction sheet. He stopped. Was Caldwell's, Maribel said. Whitaker looked at her. You already knew. I suspected, she said. Tell me the rest. Caldwell was still with the railroad then, still their legal advisor 6 months before his appointment to the bench. He authorized the adjusted survey instructions. He also authorized the contract template, the one they later used against your father. Whitaker set his cup down. His hands had stopped shaking. Something had steadied in him the way things sometimes steady in people once they've decided to stop running from something. I knew what I was helping build. I told myself it was just paperwork. Just numbers on a page. His voice went flat. I have told myself that for 2 years, and it has not gotten any easier to believe. The original documents, Maribel said. The real survey. The authorization with Caldwell's signature. Where are they? Hidden, Whitaker said. I kept copies. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I knew someday someone would come asking. There's an old railroad field office 12 miles south on the Dry Creek Road. Abandoned 3 years ago when the line rerouted. I hid the documents in the floor cavity under the back storage room. Loose board 3rd from the east wall. Maribel was already writing in her father's notebook. "Will you testify?" Walter said. The quiet that followed that question had a different quality than the quiet before it. Heavier. Whitaker looked at the table. His jaw worked once. "If I testify," he said slowly, "Caldwell will know. The railroad will know. I have a daughter in Denver. I have—" "Mr. Whitaker," Maribel said. He looked up at her. "3 families that I know of have already lost their land through this scheme. There are likely more. My father is dead, and the men who took advantage of that are trying to take everything he left us." She kept her voice even. She kept it steady. But she let him see what was behind it. Not anger, not desperation. Something quieter and more absolute than either. "I am not asking you to be fearless. I'm asking you to be right." Whitaker stared at her for a long time. "Give me until Sunday," he said. "Let me think on it." "We're in court Monday morning," Walter said. "I know." Whitaker stood up. "Sunday. I'll have an answer for you Sunday." They drove back hollow in Walter's wagon, the morning cold settling around them, and neither of them spoke for the first several miles. The land stretched out flat and wide on either side of the road, frost pale and still. "He'll testify," Maribel said finally. "You don't know that," Walter said. "He kept the documents for 2 years," she said. "A man who was only trying to protect himself burns them. He kept them because some part of him always knew this day would come and wanted to be ready for it." She looked at the road ahead. "He'll testify." Walter was quiet for a moment. "And the field office?" "We go today," she said, "before anyone else does." The abandoned railroad field office on Dry Creek Road was exactly what Whitaker had described, a squat wooden structure that had given up arguing with the weather some time ago and had simply accepted its defeat. The door wasn't locked. Maribel and Walter went in together, moving through the front room quickly through to the back storage room, where the floor was bare boards gone gray with dust and age. Third board from the east wall. Maribel knelt down and pressed her fingers along the edge of it. The board shifted. She pulled it up. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, was a stack of documents. She lifted them out carefully, set them on the floor, and untied the twine with steady hands. Walter crouched beside her. They went through the pages together in the thin light that came through the grimy window. Survey records, instruction sheets, a contract template, authorization forms. Every page systematic. Every page damning. And there on the third authorization sheet from the top in handwriting, she had seen on 15 years of court documents, Everett Caldwell's signature. "Lord Almighty," Walter said quietly. Maribel didn't say anything. She looked at that signature for a long moment. Then she began carefully rewrapping the documents in the oilcloth. "He authorized a fraudulent survey 6 months before he took the bench," she said. "And then he took the bench and started ruling on the cases built from those surveys." She tied the twine. "He wasn't just helping the railroad. He was the railroad's inside man in the court system. Every case, every family." "Maribel," Walter said carefully, "if you walk into that courtroom Monday with these documents, Caldwell will know the moment you put them on the table that Whitaker talked. And Whitaker is the only person who can authenticate them. Without his testimony, Vail will argue the documents are fabricated." She stood up with the oilcloth package held against her chest. "Then Whitaker has to testify," she said. "And if he doesn't," she looked at Walter steadily, "then I find another way. But I'm not leaving that courtroom Monday without the truth on that table. I don't care what it costs me to get it there." Walter looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a dusty shelf. "All right," he said. "Let's go." She spent Saturday at the kitchen table. Clara moved around her, quietly refilling her coffee, setting food in front of her that Maribel ate without tasting, not asking questions, because she could read her daughter well enough to know that questions right now would cost more than they gave back. Maribel spread the oilcloth documents beside her father's genuine contracts, beside the railroad's forged agreement, beside the death records and the signature comparisons. She built the case on the table, the way her father had taught her to build an argument from the foundation. Up every piece needing to support the next, no gaps, No assumptions. Nothing that couldn't be held up to daylight and examined. The story the documents told was not complicated. It was simple in the way that the worst kinds of corruption are simple. One man in the right position, willing to use it, and a system around him that had learned to look away because looking away was profitable. Caldwell had identified valuable land parcels for the railroad while still their advisor. He had authorized fraudulent surveys that inflated the recorded value and boundary of those parcels. He had created or approved the contract templates used to fake the purchase agreements. And then he had moved to the bench, and from the bench, he had ruled on the cases that arose when families resisted, and he had ensured those families lost. Every time, without exception. Her father had been one name on a longer list. She pressed her palm flat against the table and sat with that for a moment. The specific grief of it, not just losing him, but the deliberate calculated nature of how they'd waited until he was gone, and then moved on the land immediately before the family could organize, before they could find help, timed to the window of maximum vulnerability. They had done this before. They knew exactly how long grief takes to loosen a person's grip. "Mama," she said. Clara came to the table and sat down. "How many people knew Papa was sick?" Maribel said. "In the months before, who knew it was serious?" Clara thought. "The doctor, Pastor Webb, a few of the neighboring families." She paused. Gerald Marsh came to the house twice in October, said he was making a courtesy call, wanting to discuss the land on behalf of the railroad. Thomas sent him away both times. She stopped. Her face changed. "He knew. Marsh knew how sick your father was. He came to see for himself." "And he reported back," Maribel said. "And they started preparing the documents, so that the moment Papa died, they were ready." Clara sat very still. "They planned it around his death," she said. "Yes." The words sat between them like something physical. Clara reached across the table and picked up the oilcloth package. She looked at Caldwell's signature on the authorization sheet for a long time. Her hands were perfectly steady. "You burn these people down," she said quietly. "You hear me, every single one of them." "Yes, ma'am," Maribel said. Sunday came and went without word from Whitaker. By Sunday evening, Maribel was sitting on the porch in the cold, watching the road, and Walter Grayson's wagon appeared at the far end of it just before dark. He drove up to the house and climbed down, and didn't say anything until he was standing at the foot of the porch steps. "He's gone," Walter said. Something dropped in Maribel's chest. "Gone where?" "I don't know. House was empty when I rode out this afternoon. Bed made. A few things missing from the shelves. He cleared out sometime between yesterday and today." Walter climbed the steps and sat down heavily in the other porch chair. "Either he got scared and ran, or somebody got to him first." "Somebody got to him first," Maribel said. "You don't know. They knew I went to see him," she said. "Somebody told them. Same somebody who told Caldwell about the death certificate before I presented it in court." She looked at the darkening road. "They know what I have and they know what I need. They took away my witness." Walter was quiet. "Without Whitaker," she said carefully. "I have the documents, but I can't authenticate them. Caldwell will have Vail argue they're fabricated. He'll sustain every objection. He'll throw them out." She pressed her hands together in her lap. "And then Monday morning, I walk in there with the whole truth in my hands and no way to prove it." "Is there anyone else?" Walter said. "Anyone who worked with Whitaker on those surveys? Anybody who was in that field office when those instructions came through?" Maribel thought. She went back through everything Whitaker had told them, the regional office, the instruction sheets, the authorization chain. "Whitaker said the adjusted instructions came through the regional office," she said slowly. "Someone handled those papers before they reached him. A clerk, a filing officer. Somebody in that office received Caldwell's authorization and processed it." "That was 2 years ago," Walter said. "The regional office moved with the line reroute, but the people who worked there didn't move," Maribel said. She was already reaching for her father's notebook. "There were people in that office who saw those documents." "Walter, I need the names of everyone who worked in that regional office in January of 1883. "Maribel, it's Sunday night. Court is at 9 tomorrow morning." I know what time court is, she said. I need those names. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. Give me 2 hours, he said. He came back in 90 minutes with 3 names. 2 of them meant nothing to her. The third made her sit very still. A man named Robert Cassidy, who had worked as chief filing clerk at the Western Valley Railroad Regional Office from 1881 to 1883. Who had left that position abruptly in the spring of 1883, right around the time the Hartwell claim was being filed. Who currently ran a small print shop on the east side of Red Hollow, 2 blocks from the courthouse. Who had been sitting in the back row of the courtroom on Friday. Maribel looked up from the notebook. He was there, she said. Friday. He came to watch. Walter's expression shifted. A man who just wants to watch doesn't come to a land hearing that's got nothing to do with him. No, Maribel said. He doesn't. She was already standing, reaching for her coat. He came because he wanted to see if I was going to find it. He's been living with this for 2 years, same as Whitaker. Same guilt, same silence. She pulled her coat on. And I think he came on Friday because part of him was hoping I would. It's 8 o'clock at night, Walter said. I know, she said. Let's go. Robert Cassidy answered his door in his shirt sleeves with ink stains on his hands, and the look of a man who had not been sleeping well. He took one look at Maribel and Walter on his step, and something in his face crumpled slightly. Not surprise, not alarm, but something that had been held tightly for a long time and was now recognizing the moment it had been held tightly for. Miss Hartwell, he said. You were in that courtroom Friday, Maribel said. I was. You worked in the Western Valley Railroad Regional Office in January of 1883. You were the chief filing clerk. Cassidy looked at her. Then he looked past her at the dark street. Come inside, he said. His front room was small and paper-crowded and smelled of ink and something that might have been sawdust. He didn't sit down. Neither did they. I processed the authorization for the Hartwell survey instructions, he said. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed saying alone in the dark. Caldwell's signature came through on the authorization sheet. I recognized it was wrong. The boundary adjustments weren't consistent with the actual parcel dimensions. The instructions had been altered from the standard form. I knew what it meant. He stopped. I filed it anyway. I told myself I was a clerk. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself... His voice broke slightly, and he pressed his lips together and got it back. I told myself a lot of things. He left the job right after, Walter said. I left because I couldn't stay, Cassidy said. But leaving didn't make it right. It just made it quieter. He looked at Maribel. I saw your father's name on that authorization. I remembered thinking this man doesn't know what's coming. This man is going to lose everything, and he doesn't know it yet. His voice went low. I'm sorry. For what that's worth to you. I'm sorry. Maribel looked at him steadily. It's worth something, she said. And I need more than sorry right now. I know, Cassidy said. I have the documents from the field office. The original survey records the adjusted instruction sheets. Caldwell's authorization signature. But I've lost my witness who can authenticate them. Without someone who was there who handled those papers, who can testify that those documents are genuine. I can testify to that, Cassidy said. The room went quiet. I handled those documents personally, he said. I can identify Caldwell's signature on the authorization. I can describe the chain of processing, where they came from, how they moved through the office, who else saw them. He straightened. Something in him had changed in the last 60 seconds. Something that had been bent was trying to come back to vertical. I should have done this 2 years ago. I should have done it the day I filed those papers. Mr. Cassidy, Walter said carefully, if you testify against Caldwell in his own courtroom, the railroad will come after you. Your business. Everything you've built here. Cassidy looked at him. I know that. You're certain. I've been not certain for 2 years, Cassidy said. I've been sleeping badly and eating less and walking past that courthouse every morning, trying not to think about the families who lost their land because I filed a piece of paper and kept my mouth shut. He looked at Maribel. I'm done being not certain. Tell me what time to be there. 9 o'clock, Maribel said. Do not be late. I won't be, he said. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the oilcloth documents and her father's notebook, and she built her Monday morning argument from the ground up twice. Restructured it once. Rebuilt it again. She wrote out every question she intended to ask Cassidy. She wrote out every objection Vale would likely raise and every counter she intended to make. She wrote out the sequence of evidence, the death records first, the signature comparison, second, the oilcloth documents, third, Cassidy's testimony, fourth, the story building from its simplest point to its most damning one, each piece locking into the next. Clara came downstairs at 2 a.m. and didn't say anything. Just set a fresh candle on the table and a cup of coffee and went back to bed. At 4 o'clock, Maribel set the pencil down. Read through everything she had written. Close the notebook. Then she folded her hands on the table and looked at the candle flame and thought about her father, not about the case, not about Monday morning, just about him, his hands on a saddle, his voice reading to her on winter evenings, the way he laughed, which was quiet, and came up slowly, like water rising. The way he had never once in all her life looked at her and seen anything less than exactly what she was. She thought, I hope you can see this, Papa. Then she went upstairs and lay down on her bed with her boots still on, and closed her eyes and rested, if not slept, until the sky outside the window began to go gray. She was up and dressed before the light was full. She gathered the documents. She picked up the notebook. She put on her coat. And then the front door opened, and Clara was standing there in her good dress, the dark green one she wore to serious occasions, with her hat already pinned, and her hands folded in front of her. I'm coming with you, Clara said. Maribel looked at her mother. Mama? Don't, Clara said. Don't tell me to stay home. That is my land too. Those are my papers he forged. That was my husband he waited to die. Her voice was steady, and her chin was level, and she had the look she got sometimes that reminded Maribel absolutely and completely of Thomas Hartwell. I am coming with you. Maribel looked at her for a moment. All right, she said. They walked to town together in the early morning cold, side by side on the frozen road, their breath visible in the air ahead of them. The town of Red Hollow still mostly quiet around them as they came up the main street toward the courthouse. Walter Grayson was waiting on the front steps. He looked tired in a way that suggested he hadn't slept either. When he saw Clara beside Maribel, he simply nodded once, like this made sense to him, like this was exactly right. Cassidy, Maribel said. Not here yet, Walter said. She looked at the courthouse door, looked at the clock above the entrance, 8:42, 17 minutes. He'll be here, she said. At 8:51, Robert Cassidy came up the street with his hat in his hand and his ink-stained hands visible at his sides, and the particular walk of a man who has made a decision he intends to live with. He stopped in front of them. I'm here, he said. Yes, you are, Maribel said. Thank you. He nodded. Looked at Clara. Something passed between them. Recognition maybe of what this cost and what it was worth. Let's go in, Maribel said. The courtroom that Monday morning was fuller than Friday. Word had gotten around over the weekend, not just about the case, but about the bet. About Judge Caldwell's challenge. The courthouse was standing room, and then some people lining the walls, people craning from the back. There was a different quality to the attention this morning, sharper, more charged, the way a room feels when people sense that what they're about to watch matters beyond the walls they're sitting in. Harrison Vale was at the plaintiff's table, and he was the first person to see Cassidy walk in behind Maribel. His eyes went to Cassidy, stayed there a moment, moved to Maribel's face, and went carefully neutral. He turned back to his papers. But his right hand, Maribel noticed, was very still on the table. Too still. The stillness of a man working hard at appearing calm. Caldwell entered at 9 o'clock exactly. He settled into his bench. He looked at the packed room with the slight satisfaction of a man who enjoys a full house. He looked at Maribel. His eyes went briefly to Cassidy, a flicker fast filed away, and then he arranged his expression into the measured authority of a man who has 15 years of practice making rooms believe whatever he needs them to believe. Court is in session, he said. This is the resumed hearing in the matter of Western Valley Railroad versus the estate of Thomas Hartwell. We are proceeding to closing arguments and final evidence. Mr. Vail, you may begin. Vail stood. He delivered his closing with precision, clean, methodical, building the railroad's case piece by piece to its inevitable conclusion. He was good at this. He was very good at this. He had the particular gift of making illegal things sound administrative, making theft sound like paperwork, making the destruction of a family sound like a routine transaction. When he sat down, the room felt the weight of what he'd built. Maribel stood up. She set the oilcloth package on the table. She set her father's notebook beside it. She looked at Judge Everett Caldwell. Your Honor, she said, the defense calls Robert Cassidy to testify. Vail was on his feet immediately. Objection. This witness was not disclosed in the defendant's. The defendant is self-represented and operating under emergency discovery circumstances. Maribel said, her voice clean and direct. The witness has direct material knowledge of the fraudulent documents at the center of this case. Excluding him would deny the court access to the only evidence capable of establishing the full truth of this matter. The courtroom was very quiet. Caldwell looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, fast, complex, the calculation of a man running options at speed. I'll allow it, he said, provisionally. Mr. Vail may cross-examine. Vail sat down, slowly. Cassidy walked to the witness chair with steady steps and sat down and folded his hands and looked at Maribel. Mr. Cassidy, she said, please tell the court your position with Western Valley Railroad in January of 1883. Chief Filing Clerk, Regional Office, Cassidy said. I processed all incoming authorizations and outgoing survey instructions for the Tarrant County Territory. Did you process the survey authorization for the Thomas Hartwell property boundary assessment? I did. And who authorized that survey? Cassidy looked at the courtroom. Then he looked at Caldwell. Everett Caldwell, he said. At the time legal advisor to Western Valley Railroad. The room broke open. The noise that filled the courtroom was not like anything Maribel had heard in that room before. Friday's murmur had been surprise. This was something older and deeper, the sound of people who had lived inside a lie for years and were hearing the first true thing said out loud in a long time. It moved through the benches like a current person to person, and it didn't stop when Caldwell reached for his gavel. He brought it down 3 times before the room came back to quiet. Order, he said. His voice was controlled, his face was controlled, but his knuckles on the gavel were white. This court will have order. The room settled, barely. Harrison Vail was on his feet before the echo of the gavel died. Your Honor, I must object in the strongest possible terms. This witness has appeared without prior disclosure. His testimony is clearly rehearsed, and the suggestion that Judge Caldwell had any improper connection to Mr. Vail. Caldwell's voice came out flat. Sit down. Vail stopped. Something passed between them fast. The communication of 2 men who have operated together long enough to speak without speaking. Vail sat. Caldwell looked at Cassidy. His expression was the expression of a man who has looked at difficult things before and has learned to look at them without blinking. Mr. Cassidy, he said carefully, you are making a serious allegation. I want to be certain the court understands the weight of what you're claiming. Are you testifying that I personally authorized a fraudulent survey instruction? I'm testifying that Everett Caldwell's signature appeared on the authorization sheet for the adjusted boundary instructions for the Thomas Hartwell property survey in January of 1883, Cassidy said. I processed that document with my own hands. I recognized the signature, and I kept a copy of the authorization before I filed it. Caldwell's jaw shifted slightly. Just slightly. Your Honor, Maribel said, the defense would like to present the documents recovered from the Western Valley Railroad field office on Dry Creek Road. She lifted the oilcloth package and began unwrapping it at the table. These include the original survey records, the adjusted instruction sheets bearing altered boundary dimensions, and the authorization form carrying Mr. Caldwell's signature. She walked the stack to the bailiff. The bailiff looked at Caldwell. Caldwell gave the smallest nod. The bailiff took the documents to the bench. The courtroom held its breath. Caldwell looked down at the documents. He turned the pages. His face gave away nothing, nothing that an untrained observer would read as anything other than careful judicial attention. But Maribel was watching his hands. The way the third page made them pause. The way the authorization sheet made them go very still. He looked up. "Mr. Vale," he said, "your witness." Vale stood. He straightened his jacket. He walked to the center of the room with the deliberate pace of a man rebuilding his composure with each step. "Mr. Cassidy," he said, "you claim to have kept a copy of this authorization. Where has this copy been for the past 2 years?" "In my home," Cassidy said, "in a lockbox under my bed. And you chose to bring it forward now, today. The morning of closing arguments after the defendant," Vale gestured briefly toward Maribel, "came to your home the night before and asked you to testify." "She asked me to tell the truth," Cassidy said. "Yes. Isn't it possible?" Vale said, his voice taking on the smooth, reasonable tone of a man laying a careful trap, "that these documents were prepared recently. That someone who wanted to discredit this court manufactured authorization records and convinced a sympathetic former clerk to present them as genuine?" "No," Cassidy said simply. "How can you be certain?" "Because I wrote the filing date on the back of my copy in my own hand the day I processed it," Cassidy said. "January 9th, 1883. In the same ink I used for every document I filed that month. A man can't fake ink that's been drying for 2.5 years. He paused. "And because I remember that day specifically. I remember because it was the day I understood what I was helping build, and I went home that night, and I didn't sleep, and I haven't slept right since." The room was very still. Vale changed direction. "You left your position with the railroad in March of 1883. Under what circumstances?" "I resigned." "Voluntarily?" "Yes." "And yet you claim to have known about this alleged fraud at the time. You didn't report it. You didn't go to any authority. You simply left." "That's correct," Cassidy said. His voice didn't waver. "I was afraid. I am not proud of that. But I was afraid and I left, and I have lived with that choice every day since." He looked directly at Vale. "You can use that against me if you want to. It's the truth. What I'm telling you now is also the truth, and the two things can both be true at the same time." Someone in the gallery said quietly, but clearly enough to carry, "That's right." Caldwell's gavel came down once. The gallery will remain silent. But the damage was done. The room had shifted again, not toward chaos, toward something quieter and more dangerous. The particular quality of attention that develops in people who are no longer watching a performance, but witnessing something real. Vale pressed on for another 15 minutes. He was thorough. He was precise. He attacked Cassidy's timeline, his motivations, his 2-year silence, his relationship with Walter Grayson, his appearance at Friday's hearing. He built the picture of a man who had been recruited and coached and positioned. Cassidy answered every question in the same steady voice. He didn't elaborate beyond what was asked. He didn't defend himself beyond what was true. He sat in that chair like a man who had carried a weight a long distance and had finally set it down and wasn't going to pick it back up. When Vale sat down, Maribel stood. When Vale sat down, Maribel stood. "Mr. Cassidy," she said, "in your 2 years working at the regional office, how many authorization sheets bearing Everett Caldwell's signature did you process?" Cassidy thought. 40 perhaps. 45. "So you are familiar with his signature?" "Very familiar." "And the signature on the authorization for the Hartwell survey instructions, you are certain it is his?" "Certain," Cassidy said. "Thank you," Maribel said. "No further questions." She sat down. Walter Grayson beside her exhaled very slowly through his nose. Clara, 1 row back, had both hands pressed flat on her knees. Caldwell dismissed Cassidy from the stand. And then he did something that nobody in the room expected. He called a recess. 15 minutes, he said. His gavel came down. He stood and walked through the door behind the bench without looking at anyone. The 15 minutes felt like an hour. The courtroom didn't empty. People stayed in their seats or stood in clusters near the walls, voices low and urgent. Maribel stayed at her table. She didn't speak. She laid her hands flat on her father's notebook and breathed steadily and watched the door behind the bench. Walter leaned close. "He's in there deciding something," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "He could come back and throw out every piece of evidence you've put forward. Declare procedural irregularities. Postpone the ruling indefinitely. He has tools." "He has fewer than he did this morning," Maribel said. Clara appeared at her shoulder, bending down. "There are people in this room who didn't come for the railroad," she said quietly. "Look." Maribel looked. She saw it, the distribution of faces, the way the room had sorted itself in the last 15 minutes. The railroad men in the back were tighter together now, something defensive in the arrangement of them. But the rest of the room, the ordinary people, the townspeople, the families who had sat in this courtroom for years and watched what happened here, they were looking at her differently than they had on Friday. Some of them were looking at her the way people look at someone they have just decided to believe. Not enough to save her if Caldwell came back swinging, but enough to matter. The door behind the bench opened. Caldwell returned. He sat. He arranged his papers. He looked at the courtroom with the measured, unhurried expression he had worn every day for 15 years in this chair. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want to address the matter of the documents presented by the defense." Harrison Vale's pen was very still in his hand. "The court has examined the survey authorization records presented by the defense," Caldwell said. "The court notes that questions of document authenticity cannot be resolved in the course of a single hearing and would typically require expert examination. However," he paused. Maribel held herself perfectly still. "However," Caldwell continued, and something in his voice had changed, something underneath the judicial cadence that was harder to name. "The court also notes that the testimony presented by Mr. Cassidy raises substantive questions about the chain of custody of the original claim documents that cannot be dismissed on procedural grounds alone." Another pause. "The court is therefore inclined to grant a 72-hour continuance to allow—" "Your Honor." Maribel was on her feet. Every head in the room turned. "Miss Hartwell, you will wait." "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of that room, with respect. "A continuance serves no purpose other than to give the parties with the most to lose time to make the evidence disappear. Samuel Whitaker disappeared over the weekend. The threat delivered to my home tells me exactly how much time I have before additional evidence is compromised." She held up the note, the 3-word note she had kept in her father's notebook since Saturday morning. "I received this at my home 48 hours ago. Leave it alone. This is not the first time someone connected to this case has been warned into silence." The room was so quiet, she could hear her own heartbeat. Caldwell stared at her. "That is a serious accusation," he said. His voice had gone very careful. "Everything I have presented in this courtroom is serious," she said, "and all of it is true. Your Honor, you made a challenge in this courtroom on Friday in front of every person in this room. You said if I produced genuine, irrefutable evidence, you would resign from this bench." She looked at him steadily. "I have produced it. The death records prove my father could not have signed that contract. The signature comparison proves the contract is forged. The survey authorization records prove the fraud was planned before my father died, authorized by the man currently sitting on this bench, and executed through a process specifically designed to survive legal challenge because the judge ruling on it was the same man who designed it." She stopped. "Let the room hold that. Then, I am asking this court to rule today, not in 72 hours, today." The silence after she sat down lasted a long time. Harrison Vale stood slowly. "Your Honor, the defendant's conduct is—" "Mr. Vale," Caldwell said. "Sit down." Vale sat. Caldwell looked at Maribel. He looked at her for what felt like a very long time, long enough that people in the gallery began to shift, to glance at each other, to feel the weight of whatever was happening in that look. Then he looked down at his bench, and he said, "We will take a 1-hour recess." His gavel came down, and before anyone in the room could react, before Vale could move, or the gallery could speak, the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and 2 men walked in that nobody had been expecting. One of them wore a federal marshal's badge. The other was Samuel Whitaker. The noise that went through the room then was something Maribel felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. She turned in her chair. Whitaker looked different. Not the careful, frightened man from Saturday morning. Something in him had resolved the way faces resolve when a decision that has been agonized over for a long time is finally made, and there is a strange peace on the other side of it. He was walking steadily. He was looking at Maribel. The marshal, a tall man with a sun-weathered face and a badge that caught the light, walked directly to the front of the room and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, Deputy Federal Marshal James Reeves, Territorial Circuit. I've been traveling from Denver on a matter related to land fraud reports filed with the Federal Land Office last week." He paused. "I have with me a voluntary witness who contacted my office Saturday evening with information pertaining to this case and to a broader pattern of fraudulent land transfers across Tarrant County." Caldwell had not moved. He was very still on his bench, very composed, and he was looking at Samuel Whitaker with an expression that had no name, but that every person in that room understood. It was the expression of a man watching the last wall come down. "Mr. Whitaker," Maribel said, and she didn't mean to say it aloud. It simply came out quiet and almost wondering. Whitaker looked at her. "I ran," he said. He said it clearly to the whole room. "Saturday morning I ran. I packed what I could carry, and I got in my wagon, and I drove north." He stopped. "I got about 6 miles before I turned around." He looked at his hands briefly. "Your father met me twice on that survey, Miss Hartwell. He shook my hand, and he thanked me for my work, and he told me his daughter was going to inherit a fine piece of land someday." His voice roughened. "I drove 6 miles north, and I thought about that, and I turned around and I rode to Denver, and I walked into the federal marshal's office, and I told them everything." The room was absolutely silent. Walter Grayson made a sound beside Maribel. Low, involuntary, the sound of a man who has been holding something tightly for a long time. Clara behind Maribel reached forward and put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Just that. Just her hand, steady and warm. Maribel pressed her lips together, held herself together. "Your Honor," Marshal Reeves said, turning back to the bench. "I have with me a federal warrant for the seizure of all case documents related to Western Valley Railroad land claims in Tarrant County, pending investigation by the Federal Land Office. I also have a federal hold order on this proceeding, effective immediately transferring jurisdiction to the Territorial Circuit Court in Denver." He set a folded document on the bailiff's desk. "Additionally, I am placing Everett Caldwell under federal investigation for abuse of judicial office and conspiracy to commit land fraud. He is suspended from this bench effective this moment." Harrison Vale stood so fast, his chair scraped back and nearly fell. "This is completely irregular. A federal marshal cannot simply walk into a state proceeding and—" "He can when the proceeding itself is part of the fraud," Reeves said. He looked at Vale with the flat calm of a man who is not interested in argument. "And Mr. Vale, I'd suggest you consult with your own counsel before you say much more." Vale went quiet. Caldwell had not spoken. He sat on his bench, and he looked at the courtroom. The packed gallery, the turning faces, the marshal's badge, Whitaker standing steady near the back wall, Maribel at the defendant's table with her father's notebook open in front of her, and his face went through something that Maribel watched happen in real time. Not just defeat, not just exposure, the specific collapse of a man who has spent 15 years being certain, absolutely certain, that the architecture he built around himself was strong enough to hold against anything, watching it come apart in a single morning. He stood up slowly from his bench. The room watched him. He looked at Maribel. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice came out quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of the judicial resonance, the practiced authority. Just a man's voice, flat and tired. "It appears—" He stopped. "It appears the court has reached its conclusion." He stepped down from the bench. Marshal Reeves moved toward him. Caldwell didn't resist. He walked with the marshal through the side door of the courtroom, with the particular dignity of a man who has nothing left but the manner in which he makes his exit. Harrison Vale gathered his papers with hands that were not entirely steady. He did not look at Maribel. He walked out of the courtroom without speaking. And then the room, the packed, silent, stunned room full of Red Hollow, Colorado, broke entirely open. Oh! The noise that followed was the other kind. Not the sharp voltage of shock, but the longer releasing sound of something that had been held under pressure for a long time, coming finally to the surface. People were standing. People were speaking across the room to each other. Two women near the middle of the gallery were holding hands. The man from the back row, the ordinary townspeople, the shopkeeper, the blacksmith. They were looking at each other and looking at Maribel, and their faces were doing things that faces do. When something that was wrong for a long time becomes suddenly undeniably right. Walter Grayson sat beside Maribel and put his elbows on the table and pressed his face into his hands for a moment. Just a moment. Then he raised his head and looked at her and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying. Cassidy had moved from the witness chair to the wall near the door. He stood with his hat in his hands and his head slightly bowed like a man attending a service. Whitaker was making his way through the crowd toward the front of the room. People stepped back to let him pass. When he reached the defendant's table, he stopped in front of Maribel and looked at her. "I'm sorry I ran," he said. "You came back," she said. "Barely counts." "It counts," she said. "It counts for everything." He nodded. Something moved in his face, old and complicated, and finally, after a long time, beginning to ease. Marshal Reeves appeared at her elbow. He was not a man who wasted words. "Miss Hartwell, the federal hold order covers this property and all adjacent claims. The railroad's claim is frozen pending investigation. You and your mother are not going anywhere." "And the other families," Maribel said, "the ones who already lost their land." Reeves looked at her. "That's part of the investigation. It won't be fast, but it will be thorough." He paused. "The authorization documents you recovered from the field office, those will be central to the federal case. You did good work." "My father did the work," she said. "I just finished it." Reeves looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and moved back through the crowd. Clara appeared beside Maribel. She didn't say anything right away. She stood next to her daughter and looked at the courtroom, the empty bench, the people, the morning light, and her face held something that was not quite the grief she had been wearing for 14 months, and not quite happiness, but something between them. The specific expression of a person who has been living in the dark for so long that the return of light is almost too much and exactly enough. "Your father," Clara said quietly, "would have been absolutely insufferable about this." Maribel looked at her. "He would have walked around for weeks telling everyone how he always knew," Clara said. "How he planned the whole thing. How it was obvious." Her voice caught slightly. She pushed past it. "He would have been absolutely impossible to live with." "Yes, he would have," Maribel said. They stood together, while the room moved and talked and shifted around them, and after a moment, Maribel felt her mother take her hand. Outside the courthouse. The town of Red Hollow was doing what small towns do when something seismic has happened inside one of their buildings, gathering in clusters on the street, voices carrying the news, moving faster than people could walk. Maribel came out into the cold air and felt it on her face, and stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. A woman she knew from church came up to her, took both her hands, didn't say anything, just squeezed them and nodded and moved on. An older man she didn't recognize stopped beside her. "My brother lost his place on the South Ridge 3 years ago," he said. "Railroad claim, same story." He looked at her steadily. "You think there's a chance?" "The marshal said the investigation will be thorough," she said. "That's all I know. But yes, I think there's a chance." He nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. "Miss Hartwell." She watched him walk away. Walter came up beside her. He stood there with his hands in his coat pockets looking at the street. "Caldwell had a system," he said. "Took him 15 years to build it. You walked in there on Friday with your father's leather notebook, and you took it apart in 3 days." "I had help," she said. "You had the truth," he said. "Help is easier to find when you're carrying that." She looked at him. "Walter, what happens now to the case, to the investigation? Federal proceeding moves to Denver. Could take months, could take longer. He looked at her. You may have to testify again. Up there. In a real federal courtroom with prosecutors and defense counsel and the full weight of it. All right, she said. Might be difficult. More difficult than walking into Caldwell's courtroom with no lawyer and a leather notebook, she said. Walter almost smiled. Fair point. She looked back at the courthouse door. At the bench inside empty now. At the room full of people who had come to watch her lose and had watched something else happen instead. She thought about the note under the door. Leave it alone. She thought about Whitaker on the road going north 6 miles of running before his conscience turned him around. She thought about Cassidy in his print shop with ink-stained hands and 2 years of bad sleep. She thought about her father's voice reading case law to her on winter evenings, patient and precise, believing in something that most people around him had long since given up on. She thought they counted on everyone being too tired, too afraid, too beaten down by the weight of what they were up against. They forgot that sometimes the person with the least to lose is the person with the most to fight with. She turned and went back inside to gather her father's notebook. The bench was empty. She walked past it without looking at it. She picked up the notebook. She picked up the folder of documents. She tucked the oilcloth package under her arm to hand to Marshal Reeves's deputy, who was waiting near the door. Then she paused. She set her hand flat on the defendant's table, the table she had sat at for 3 days, and argued from and refused to leave, and held it there for just a moment. Her father had believed that the law protects the person who knows it. She believed something slightly different now. Something she had learned in this room in these 3 days, in the particular education of standing up when every force in the room wanted you to sit down. The law protects the person who shows up, who keeps showing up, who shows up again. She took her hand off the table, and she walked out of that courtroom into the cold Colorado morning, into whatever came next, with her head up and her father's notebook under her arm, and the whole wide frontier ahead of her. The federal investigation didn't move fast. Marshal Reeves had said thorough, and he had meant it. And thorough took time in a way that nobody who had never been through a federal proceeding quite understood until they were living inside one. Days turned into weeks. Weeks stretched toward a month. The oilcloth documents went to Denver. Cassidy gave a formal deposition that lasted 2 full days. Whitaker gave his in writing, signed and witnessed, and then did it again in person when the federal attorneys requested it. Maribel went back to the ranch and worked. That was the part nobody outside her family saw. The weeks after the courtroom, after the marshal's badge and Whitaker's return, and the empty bench. When the dramatic part was over, and the long grinding part began. She was up before sunrise every morning, doing the work the ranch required, because the ranch didn't pause for federal investigations, or emotional exhaustion, or the particular hollowness that settles into a person after they've been running on nothing but purpose for weeks, and the purpose is suddenly in someone else's hands. She fed the animals. She repaired the fence line on the north pasture where 2 posts had gone soft over the winter. She cooked with Clara in the evenings, and sat across the table from her mother. And sometimes they talked about the case, and sometimes they talked about Thomas, and sometimes they didn't talk at all, just sat in the kitchen with the fire going and the quiet around them that was different from the quiet of the months after he died. That quiet had been hollow. This one had something in it. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become peace if they gave it enough time. It was during the 3rd week that the letter arrived from Denver. Clara brought it in from the road and set it on the kitchen table without saying anything. Maribel dried her hands and picked it up. Federal Territorial Court seal on the envelope. She opened it. She read it twice. Then she sat down. "What?" Clara said. "They want me in Denver," Maribel said. "Full federal hearing, 6 weeks from now. I'll need to testify." She set the letter flat on the table. "And they've identified 9 other families." Clara sat down across from her. 9 families whose land was transferred through the same method. Same forged documents, same fraudulent surveys, same pattern. Some of them left the territory. 2 of them are still in the county. Maribel looked at her mother. "One of them is the Beaumont family, out on the West Ridge." Clara's face changed. "Margaret Beaumont. I went to school with her mother. They lost their place 2 years ago," Maribel said. The letter says the federal investigation has identified it as part of Caldwell's scheme. They sat with that for a moment. The weight of 9 families, 9 different versions of the same theft, 9 different kitchen tables where someone had read a letter or heard a knock on the door or watched men arrive before sunrise. "Then it was never just us," Clara said quietly. "No," Maribel said. "It was never just us." She looked at the letter again. 6 weeks. Denver. Federal courthouse. She thought about what Walter had said, real federal courtroom prosecutor's defense counsel, the full weight of it. She thought about what she had walked into 3 weeks ago with a leather notebook and a folder of documents and no formal training in anything except what her father had believed was worth teaching her. Denver would be different. Denver would be larger and more formal and more dangerous in different ways than Caldwell's courtroom had been. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her father's notebook. "I need to talk to Walter," she said. Walter Grayson came to the ranch that same afternoon. He read the letter standing at the kitchen table and handed it back to Maribel without sitting down. "9 families," he said. "You knew there were more." "I suspected 3, not 9. He pulled out a chair and sat. "The federal attorneys, are they providing representation for your testimony, or do you go in alone?" "The letter says a federal attorney will be assigned to work with me before the hearing," Maribel said. "But I'm a witness, not a plaintiff. The federal government is prosecuting Caldwell. I'm just the person who found the evidence." "You're more than that," Walter said. "You're the person who broke it open. The federal attorneys know that. They'll want your testimony tight and complete and unshakable, because Vail is going to be in that room too, and he is going to come at you harder than he did here. Vail is defending Caldwell in the federal hearing. Vail is defending the railroad's interests," Walter said. "Which currently means defending Caldwell, yes. He's good, Maribel. I don't want you walking into Denver thinking Friday's cross-examination was the worst he can do." "I know it wasn't," she said. "He'll come after your credibility, your qualifications, the way you obtained the field office documents. He'll argue the oilcloth package was illegally seized. He'll try to undermine Cassidy, and he'll try to discredit Whitaker." Walter looked at her steadily. "Are you ready for that?" "No," she said honestly. "But I'll be ready by Denver." He nodded. "Then we start tomorrow." They started that same evening, actually, because Walter was not the kind of man who said tomorrow when tonight was available. He came back after supper with a stack of notes he had been keeping since the first day of the hearing, and they sat at the kitchen table until late going through every piece of testimony Maribel had given and every piece she would need to give again. Clara sat with them for part of it, then went to bed, and then came back down an hour later because she couldn't sleep and made coffee and sat at the end of the table listening. "They will ask you," Walter said, "why you chose to retrieve the field office documents without informing any authority first. How do you answer that?" "Because there was no trustworthy authority to inform," Maribel said. "The only judge in the county was the man who had authorized the fraud. The marshal's office answered to the county. Any notification would have given them time to destroy the documents." "Good. Shorter, though. Don't explain your reasoning at length, it sounds defensive. State the fact." "There was no trustworthy authority in this county. Informing anyone would have given them time to destroy the evidence. Better." He made a note. "They will ask why you didn't come forward sooner. Why you waited until the hearing was already in session." "Because I didn't have enough until Cassidy," she said. "The death certificate was proof the contract was forged, but it didn't prove who forged it or why. Without the authorization chain, I had a fraudulent document and no architect. And if they ask why Whitaker and Cassidy came forward only at the last moment," Maribel was quiet for a second. "Because powerful men are frightening," she said. "And it takes time for people to decide that being right matters more than being safe." Walter looked at her across the table. "That one you don't shorten," he said. 2 weeks into the preparation, something happened that none of them had anticipated. Gerald Marsh came to the ranch, not with railroad men behind him, not with a satchel of legal documents. He came alone on a gray horse in the early afternoon when Maribel was working in the yard, and he stopped at the gate and took off his hat and held it at his side. Maribel looked at him across the gate. Miss Hartwell, he said. Mr. Marsh. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping. The careful professional composure she remembered from the porch visit 6 weeks ago was still there, but it was thinner now, worn at the edges, like a coat that had been weathered too many times. I'm not here on behalf of the company, he said. I want to be clear about that. Then why are you here? He turned his hat in his hands. I delivered the hearing notice to your door, he said. I stood on your porch, and I recited the legal language about vacating this property, and I went back to my office and I filed my report, and I told myself I was just doing my job. He paused. I knew about the date on the contract. I knew when I delivered that notice. I didn't say anything. Maribel looked at him steadily. What do you want, Mr. Marsh? I want to tell the federal attorneys what I know, he said. I have been a legal representative for this company for 8 years. I have handled land claim notices across this territory. I know which ones were legitimate and which ones weren't. He looked at her. There are more than 9 families, Miss Hartwell. There are 14. I have documentation on all of them. The word 14 landed like a stone in still water. 14, Maribel said. 14 that I can document directly, he said. There may be more I don't have records on. She looked at him for a long time. Looked at his face, at the genuine exhaustion in it, at the thing underneath the exhaustion that she recognized from Cassidy's doorway and from Whitaker's kitchen table. The particular expression of a person who has been carrying something they cannot keep carrying. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. He blinked, like he hadn't expected that. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly, and climbed down from the horse. Clara's reaction to Gerald Marsh, sitting at her kitchen table, was controlled in the way that only a woman of considerable character can control a reaction to the man who came to her door to announce that her family was being thrown off their land. She set a cup of coffee in front of him. She sat down at the end of the table. She folded her hands. 14, she said. Yes, ma'am. Say their names. Marsh looked up. The families, Clara said. If you're going to sit at this table and tell me you have documentation, you say their names first. They're not a number. Marsh held her gaze for a moment. Then he opened the satchel he'd brought and pulled out a folded list and read them. 14 names. 14 families. Ranches and farms and homesteads scattered across the valley, some familiar to Maribel and Clara, some not. People who had stood in courtrooms and lost. People who had packed wagons and left. People whose land now belonged to the railroad, or to wealthy associates of the railroad who had bought it at prices that looked legitimate on paper. When Marsh finished reading, the kitchen was quiet. All right, Clara said. She looked at Maribel. Write to the federal attorneys today. Yes, ma'am, Maribel said. She looked at Marsh. You understand what this means. Testifying against the railroad, against Caldwell. I understand, Marsh said. They will come at you. I know. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I have a wife, he said. 2 daughters. 8 years I told myself I was providing for them, doing what I had to do. He stopped. My older daughter is 12 years old. She asked me last week what kind of law work I do. He was quiet for a moment. I couldn't answer her. No one said anything. I'd like to be able to answer her, he said. Maribel wrote the letter to the federal attorneys that afternoon, and Walter Grayson wrote it to the telegraph office himself. The reply came 3 days later. The federal hearing date was moved forward 2 weeks. The scope of the investigation was formally expanded to cover all 14 documented cases. Marshal Reeves sent word that 2 additional federal marshals were being assigned to the territory, and Everett Caldwell, who had been under informal federal hold at his home in Red Hollow, was formally arrested and transported to Denver to await trial. The day Caldwell was taken through town was a day Maribel did not go into Red Hollow to watch. She heard about it afterward. Walter described it, and a woman from church described it, and the details came to her secondhand, which was how she preferred it. She didn't need to see Caldwell in handcuffs. She needed to know the families would get their land back. Those were different things, and she had learned enough in the past month to know the difference. What she did go into Red Hollow for 3 days after Caldwell's arrest was a meeting at the courthouse, the same building, but with a federal administrator sitting at Caldwell's bench and a different quality of air in the room. 9 of the 14 affected families were there. Some of them Maribel knew. Some were strangers who had driven from distances to be in that room. They sat in the gallery benches and looked at the federal administrator and at each other with the cautious, slightly disbelieving expressions of people who have been told good news before and learned not to trust it. The federal administrator, a compact man named Arthur Greer, who spoke quietly and precisely, laid out the process. The fraudulent transfers would be reviewed individually. The Federal Land Office would issue provisional restoration orders for properties where the fraud could be clearly documented, which, based on the evidence already assembled, covered 11 of the 14 cases. The remaining 3 would require additional investigation. He answered questions for 2 hours. When it was over, a woman Maribel didn't know came up to her near the door. She was perhaps 60, with work-worn hands, and an expression that had the specific quality of someone who has been carrying something heavy for so long that they've forgotten what it was like not to. "We lost our place 2 years ago," the woman said. "My husband, he never recovered from it. He died last spring." She stopped. "He died thinking it was gone forever." Maribel looked at her. "I'm so sorry," she said, because there was nothing else true to say, and the woman deserved the truth, not a speech. "I know," the woman said. "I just wanted to tell you." She took Maribel's hand in both of hers. "He would have liked you," she said. "My Hank. He would have shaken your hand and told you that you did right." Her voice was steady, even though her eyes weren't. "I'm telling you for him." Maribel couldn't speak for a moment. "Thank you," she managed. The woman squeezed her hands once and let go and walked away through the courthouse door. Walter appeared at Maribel's elbow. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which was exactly the right thing. After a moment, Maribel straightened her shoulders. "Denver," she said. "4 weeks," Walter said. "Then we have 4 weeks." They used all of them. Every evening at the kitchen table, Walter and Maribel worked through the testimony. Every Vale might ask every angle of attack, every procedural challenge to the field office documents. Marsh came twice more with additional records, and each time Maribel added to the picture she was building, not just the Hartwell case now, but the full architecture of what Caldwell had constructed, the complete scope of 15 years of deliberate systematic theft carried out through the courts that were supposed to prevent exactly that. Cassidy came once. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee, and went through his own anticipated testimony, with Maribel asking the questions and Walter watching. He was steadier than he'd been the first night she'd come to his door. The bad sleep was still there in his face. She thought it might be there for a long time, but the particular hunted quality was gone. "You're going to do fine," Maribel told him. "I know what I did wrong," he said. "I don't find it easy going back through it." "No," she said. "But you know what you're doing right now. Hold on to that." He looked at her. "You sound like your father." "People keep telling me that," she said. "I'm starting to believe them." Whitaker wrote her a letter from his sister's house in New Mexico, where he'd gone after his federal deposition. 2 pages careful handwriting. He told her the federal attorneys had his full testimony, and he would appear in Denver if required. He told her he had slept through the night for the first time in 2 years, the week after he testified. He ended the letter with a single sentence. "I hope Thomas Hartwell knows his daughter did right by him." She folded the letter into the notebook with everything else. The night before they left for Denver, Clara came into Maribel's room and sat on the edge of the bed while Maribel packed. "Are you afraid?" Clara asked. Maribel thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "Different kind of afraid than before. The first time I was afraid of failing. Now I'm afraid of the size of it. How many people it involves. How much it matters beyond just us." "It always mattered beyond just us," Clara said. "You knew that before you walked into Caldwell's courtroom." "I knew it. But knowing something and feeling the full weight of it are different." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Your father used to say that the weight of a thing is how you know it's real," she said. That things that matter don't feel light. He said that after you were born, Clara said. He held you for the first time, and he said she doesn't weigh much yet, but she will. She's going to be the kind of person who carries things that matter. She smiled, a real one, the kind that reached her eyes, the kind Maribel hadn't seen often enough in the past 14 months. He was right, as it turned out. Maribel stopped packing. She sat down beside her mother on the edge of the bed, and they sat there together in the lamplight, the packed bag on the floor at their feet. Denver ahead of them, and Red Hollow behind them, and the ranch outside, quiet and intact, and theirs. I miss him, Maribel said. Every day, Clara said. I want him to see this. He sees it, Clara said. She said it with the quiet certainty of a woman who has made peace with the things she cannot prove and has decided to believe them anyway. He's seen all of it, every bit. They sat there for a while longer, not talking, just together. Then Maribel stood up and finished packing. Denver was everything Walter had said it would be, larger, more formal. The federal courthouse was a different scale entirely from Caldwell's courtroom, higher ceilings, more officials, more lawyers, the full organized machinery of federal justice in motion. Maribel walked in on the first morning in a dress she had bought specifically for the occasion. Dark gray wool, well-fitted, severe in a way she had chosen deliberately, and she felt the size of the room try to press down on her, and she pressed back. The federal attorney assigned to work with her was a woman. Her name was Catherine Aldridge. She was 41 years old, had been practicing federal law in Denver for 12 years, and had the specific quality of a person who has spent their career being underestimated and has long since stopped finding it interesting. She shook Maribel's hand the first morning with a grip that meant business. I've read everything, Aldridge said. The death records, the signature comparisons, the field office documents, Cassidy's deposition, Whitaker's statement, Marsh's records, all 14 cases. She looked at Maribel directly. You built a stronger evidentiary case as a self-represented layperson than most licensed attorneys would have built in the same circumstances. My father taught me, Maribel said. Your father taught you well. Aldridge set a thick folder on the table between them. Now I'm going to teach you how to survive Harrison Vale in a federal courtroom. Are you ready? Maribel sat down. Yes, she said. She was. The federal hearing opened on a Tuesday morning with a courtroom gallery that was fuller than anyone had anticipated. Word had spread, not just within Denver's legal community, but beyond it. The story of what had happened in Red Hollow had traveled in the way that stories travel when they carry something. People recognized something about power and theft, and a woman who refused to accept either. There were people in that gallery who had no legal interest in the proceedings at all. They had simply come because they wanted to see it. Maribel took the stand on the second day. She answered Aldridge's questions the way they had prepared, clear, direct, precise, no elaboration beyond what was asked. No emotion performed, but no emotion hidden either. She told the story from the beginning. The men before sunrise. The knock on the door. The death certificate. The notebook. The courtroom. The field office. Cassidy. Whitaker. All of it piece by piece, the way her father had taught her to build an argument. From the foundation up. When Aldridge finished, Vale stood up. How was composed? He was professional. He was, as Walter had warned, harder than he had been in Red Hollow. He came at the field office documents first, the legality of the retrieval, the chain of custody, the absence of official authorization. He was precise and relentless and very good. Maribel answered him the way she and Walter had practiced. There was no trustworthy authority in this county, she said. Informing anyone would have given them time to destroy the evidence. Vale shifted. Came at her credibility, her qualifications, her self-representation, the convenient timing of Cassidy's appearance. Mr. Cassidy came forward because the truth was available to him, and he chose it, Maribel said. The timing was determined by when I found him, not by what was convenient. Vale pressed. She held. For 3 hours, she sat in that chair and answered every question Vale had, and she did not break, and she did not waver, and she did not give him anything he could use because she had spent 4 weeks at a kitchen table in Red Hollow preparing for exactly this, and her father had spent the years before that preparing her for everything else. When Vale finally sat down, the courtroom was quiet. The federal judge, a heavy-set man with white hair, and the expression of someone who has heard a great deal in his career and is not easily moved, looked at Maribel over the bench. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "the court thanks you for your testimony." She nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." She stepped down from the stand. She walked back to the gallery where Clara was sitting, and she sat down beside her mother, and Clara took her hand without looking at her and held it tightly while the proceedings continued around them. The ruling came on a Thursday afternoon. Everett Caldwell was found guilty on 7 counts of abuse of judicial office, 4 counts of conspiracy to commit land fraud, and 2 counts of obstruction of justice. Harrison Vale was censured and referred to the territorial bar for disciplinary proceedings. The Western Valley Railroad was ordered to cooperate fully with the Federal Land Office's restoration process. 11 of the 14 families received immediate provisional restoration orders for their properties. The other 3 were put on an expedited review schedule. Maribel heard the ruling from the gallery with Clara on one side of her and Walter Grayson on the other. And when the judge finished reading and the courtroom reacted, she sat very still for a long moment while the sound moved around her. Walter leaned over. 11 families, he said. 11 today, Maribel said. 3 more soon. And the Hartwells, he said. She looked at him. The Hartwells were never in doubt, she said. Not after Monday morning in Caldwell's courtroom. He smiled. A real one. The kind she didn't see on Walter Grayson often enough. No, he said. I suppose they weren't. Outside the federal courthouse in the cold Denver air, Catherine Aldridge found Maribel on the steps. Well done, Aldridge said. Well done to you, Maribel said. You carried most of it in there. I carried the legal procedure, Aldridge said. You built the case. There's a difference. She paused. What do you intend to do next, now that this is finished? Maribel looked at her. Go home, she said. Take care of the ranch. And after that, Maribel thought about the woman from the courthouse meeting in Red Hollow, whose husband had died thinking the land was gone forever. She thought about the 14 families on Marsh's list. She thought about all the people who had stood in front of Caldwell's bench for 15 years with no one on their side who knew what she knew. I don't know yet, she said honestly. But I think there's more work. Aldridge studied her for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and produced a card. If you ever decide you want to make it official, she said, you come find me. Maribel looked at the card. Denver Law Office Address. S. Catherine Aldridge, Attorney at Law. She looked up. You're offering to sponsor me for the bar, she said. I'm telling you that what you did in that courtroom in Red Hollow and what you did in there this week is more than most licensed attorneys manage in their careers. Aldridge met her eyes. Your father taught you the law. You taught yourself how to use it. The bar examination would take you 6 months to prepare. A pause. I've seen what you do in 6 months when you're motivated. Clara, standing just behind Maribel, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Maribel looked at the card for another moment. Then she put it in her father's notebook next to Whitaker's letter, next to the note that said, "Leave it alone," next to the death certificate that had started everything. I'll think on it, she said. That's all I ask, Aldridge said. She shook Maribel's hand again, with that same grip that meant business, and walked back up the courthouse steps. Clara came up beside Maribel and stood there looking at the street. She's right, you know, Clara said. I know, Maribel said. Your father would say the same thing. I know that too. Maribel put the notebook under her arm. Let's go home first. Everything else after that. Clara took her arm and they walked down the federal courthouse steps together into the cold Denver afternoon. And behind them, the machinery of justice that Maribel Hartwell had forced back into motion was still turning, grinding forward, slow and imperfect and real. They came home on a Friday. The wagon turned off the main road onto the Hartwell property just before noon, and when the familiar gate came into view, Clara made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something that started in the chest and came out without asking permission. She pressed her hand over her mouth and held it there for a moment, and Maribel reached over without looking and put her hand over her mother's and kept driving. The ranch was exactly as they had left it. The fence line, the yard, the house with the kitchen window catching the midday light. 14 months of grief and 6 weeks of fighting, and 3 days in a federal courthouse in Denver. And here it was, unchanged, unhurried, entirely itself. Maribel set the brake on the wagon and climbed down. She stood in the yard and looked at the house and felt something move through her that she didn't have a precise name for. Not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. Not triumph, though that was in there too. Something quieter than either. Something that had to do with her father's hands on this ground and her mother's mornings in that kitchen and the specific weight of a place that has been fought for and won. She was still standing there when she heard the horse on the road. Walter Grayson came through the gate on his gray mare, looking like a man who had been watching for their wagon for the better part of the morning. "You're back," he said. "We're back," Maribel said. He climbed down, looked at her face, looked at Clara, who had come around the wagon with reddened eyes and her chin level. He took off his hat. 11 families, he said. 11, Maribel said. And the other 3 on expedited review. Marshal Reeves sent word yesterday that he expects those orders within the month. Walter turned his hat in his hands once. It was the most emotion she had ever seen him display in a single gesture. "Come inside," Clara said. "I'll make coffee, and something to eat because I have had nothing but courthouse food for 3 days, and I am finished with it." Walter almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They went inside. Red Hollow took about a week to decide how it felt. That was the honest truth of small towns. They didn't react to things all at once. They processed. They talked to each other in the general store, in the church, in the barbershop, and across fence lines, and the talking built until something like a collective position emerged. Sometimes that position was the right one, and sometimes it wasn't, but it always took about a week. By the following Friday, the town had decided. It decided the way Maribel found out about, mostly in pieces, through the people who came to the ranch. The woman from church who had squeezed her hands outside the federal courthouse meeting came back with a jar of preserves and sat in the kitchen for an hour. The blacksmith she'd seen in the courtroom gallery came by to fix a hinge on the barn door that had been loose for months and wouldn't take payment. 2 of the families named in the federal ruling came to the ranch on the same afternoon separately, and both times Maribel sat across the table from people who were trying to say something that didn't have easy words and did her best to make it easier. The Beaumont family. Margaret Beaumont, whose mother had gone to school with Clara, came on a Wednesday morning. Margaret was 61 years old and had the build and bearing of a woman who had spent her life doing hard physical work and had no apologies for it. She came alone. She sat down at the kitchen table, and Clara poured coffee, and Margaret wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at Maribel directly. "We're getting the place back, she said. "The federal order came yesterday." "I know," Maribel said. "Marshal Reeves sent word." 2 years, Margaret said. 2 years we've been renting a room above the feed store. My husband Earl has been doing day work wherever he can find it." She stopped, looked at the coffee, looked back up. "He cried when we got the letter. Earl Beaumont, who I have not seen cry since his mother passed, sat down at the kitchen table yesterday and cried like a boy." Her own voice roughened. "I told him, I said, Earl, a 24-year-old girl walked into Caldwell's courtroom with nothing but her dead father's law books, and she did not quit. She just did not quit." She looked at Maribel steadily. "I needed to come here and tell you that, in person." Maribel looked at her. "How long before you can move back in?" "Federal administrator says 4 to 6 weeks to clear the railroad's claim and restore the deed. The house needs work. They've been using it for equipment storage." Margaret's jaw tightened briefly, then released. "Doesn't matter. We know how to work." "If you need hands," Maribel said, "you come find us." Margaret looked at her. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise maybe at the directness of it. Then she nodded. "I will," she said. "Thank you." After Margaret left, Clara stood at the kitchen window for a moment without speaking. 14 families, she said finally. 14. Maribel agreed. Your father used to say that the measure of a wrong isn't the one it starts with. It's everyone it reaches before it's stopped. Clara turned from the window. You stopped it. We stopped it, Maribel said. All of us. Cassidy, Whitaker, Marsh, Walter. You. Me, Clara said with a slight raise of her eyebrows. You didn't tell me to quit, Maribel said simply. Not once. Not when we had no lawyer. Not when the note came under the door. Not the morning before I walked into Caldwell's courtroom. You said, all right, baby, let's get to work. She held her mother's gaze. That matters. That's not nothing. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she pressed her lips together and nodded once and turned back to the window, and Maribel let her have that moment, because some things are too full to answer out loud. The letter from Catherine Aldridge arrived 3 weeks after they returned home. Maribel recognized the Denver postmark before she even opened it. She sat down at the kitchen table with her coffee and read it carefully twice the way she read everything that mattered. Aldridge had written to tell her that the bar examination in Denver was scheduled for early spring, that the sponsorship offer stood, that the federal attorneys who had worked the Caldwell prosecution were, in Aldridge's words, uniformly of the opinion that the legal community in the Colorado Territory needed more people who thought the way Maribel Hartwell thought. She also wrote, I have handled federal land fraud cases for 12 years. I have never seen anyone identify the architecture of a fraudulent scheme faster or more precisely than you did. That is not a skill that is taught in law school. It is a skill that belongs to people who understand both the law and the human beings who abuse it. You have both. Don't waste them. Maribel set the letter down. She sat at the table for a long time. She thought about the woman whose husband had died, thinking the land was gone forever. She thought about Margaret Beaumont's husband crying at the kitchen table. She thought about the 14 names on Gerald Marsh's list and the families who hadn't been on any list yet, the ones in other counties and other territories where men like Caldwell were still sitting on benches and making bets they were certain they couldn't lose. She picked up the letter. She went to find her mother. Clara was in the yard. She turned when she heard Maribel's boots on the porch. Maribel held out the letter. Clara read it. She read it slowly the way she read serious things, and when she finished, she folded it and held it in both hands and looked at her daughter. Denver, she said. Spring, Maribel said. 6 months to prepare. Then the bar examination. Then, she stopped. Then you're a lawyer, Clara said. Then I'm a lawyer. Clara was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has a great deal inside it. The ranch, she said. I'm not leaving, Maribel said. Denver is 3 days' ride. I can work here and study here and ride to Denver for the examination and come home. She paused. And after Aldridge said there's federal work out of the Denver office, territory-wide, land fraud property rights cases like ours. Cases like ours, Clara repeated softly. Except without anyone to fight for them. Not anymore, Maribel said. Clara looked at her for a long time in the way she sometimes looked at Maribel, like she was seeing two things at once, the daughter in front of her, and the girl that daughter used to be, and the distance between them that was made entirely of hard years and deliberate choices. Your father, Clara said. The day you were born, he said to me, Clara, this one is going to cost us sleep. She paused. He was right every single year. I know, Maribel said. He meant it as a compliment, Clara said. I know that too. Clara reached out and took the letter back from Maribel's hand. She looked at it once more. Then she held it out. Write to Aldridge today, she said. Tell her yes. Walter Grayson's reaction was simpler. He showed up at the ranch the following afternoon. She had not yet told him about the letter, but Walter had a way of appearing when things were being decided as though his instincts operated on a different schedule than most people's, and she told him about Aldridge's offer over coffee at the kitchen table. He listened. He didn't say anything until she was finished. Then he said, About time. She looked at him. That's your response. What else would I say? He set his cup down. Maribel, I spent 23 years as a lawman in this territory. I have known exactly 4 people in my life who understood the law the way you understand it. Not the words of it, the shape of it, the way it moves and where it breaks, and what it's actually for. He looked at her directly. 3 of them were licensed attorneys. 1 of them was your father. He paused. Now I know 5. She held his gaze. I'm going to need study materials, she said. Federal Procedure, Territorial Statutes, Evidence Law. I'll start pulling books tomorrow, he said. I know a retired federal attorney in Colorado Springs who will lend us anything we need. We, she said. Did you think I was going to let you do this alone? He said. She almost smiled. No, she said. I didn't. The studying began the following Monday, 6 months of mornings at the kitchen table and evenings by the fire. Her father's books and borrowed volumes from Walter's Colorado Springs Contact, stacked in rotating piles. The bar examination syllabus spread across the table like a map of everything she needed to know. She worked through property law and contract law and evidence procedure and federal jurisdiction and criminal statutes and the specific rules of the Colorado territorial courts, and she worked through them with the focused, systematic attention of someone who has already used this knowledge in the field and understands exactly what the gaps in it cost. Clara sat with her some evenings, not studying, just present. Sometimes she read, sometimes she mended. Once she fell asleep in the chair, and Maribel worked until midnight around the soft sound of her mother's breathing, and didn't wake her because the company was worth more than the quiet. Robert Cassidy came by in October with a question, and stayed for 3 hours going over the details of his federal testimony and whether any additional follow-up was required. He was sleeping better. He said so plainly without embarrassment, the way people say things when they've stopped performing composure and started actually having it. His print shop was doing well. 2 of the families whose land restoration was going through had given him their printing business as a form of thanks they didn't know how else to express. You know, he said before he left, when you came to my door that Sunday night, 9 o'clock, 2 strangers on the step, I almost didn't open it. But you did, Maribel said. I did. He put his hat on. I keep thinking about that. The version of me that doesn't open the door. He shook his head. I don't like that version. He doesn't exist anymore, Maribel said. You opened the door. Cassidy looked at her, nodded once. Good night, Miss Hartwell, he said. Good night, Mr. Cassidy. In November something happened that none of them had anticipated. Gerald Marsh came to the ranch for the 3rd time, and this time he brought a woman with him, his wife Eleanor, a small, quiet woman with sharp eyes and the particular composed manner of someone who makes assessments quickly and keeps them to herself until she's certain. They sat at the kitchen table, and Eleanor Marsh looked at Maribel for the first time and said, You're younger than I expected. Most people say that, Maribel said. Gerald told me about the Sunday night you came to his office, Eleanor said. He told me what he told you about our daughters. She paused. Our older daughter wants to be a doctor. People tell her she'll be a nurse. She looked at Maribel steadily. I wanted to meet you. I'm glad you came, Maribel said. I want her to know your name, Eleanor said simply. I want her to know there are women who walk into rooms that weren't built for them and change what gets built next. She folded her hands on the table. Will you write her a letter? Maribel looked at her. Yes, she said. I will. She wrote it that evening. 2 pages. She told the girl 12 years old wanting to be a doctor that the people who tell you what you can't do are the least qualified people in the room. That the work of becoming something is longer and harder than anyone warns you and more worth it than anyone promises. That her father's name was Thomas Hartwell, and he had given her books when most people would have given her limits, and those books had saved her family's land, and 15 families along with it. And knowledge is the one thing that cannot be taken by someone who didn't give it to you. She signed it Maribel Hartwell, Red Hollow, Colorado. Eleanor Marsh read it at the kitchen table before she left, and when she finished, she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and pressed her hand flat over it once, like she was making sure it was real. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The twist that none of them saw coming arrived in December in the form of a second letter from Catherine Aldridge. Not about the bar examination this time. Aldridge wrote that the federal investigation, now fully expanded, had uncovered something beyond the 14 families on Marsh's list. Something larger. A network of similar schemes operating across 3 territories, Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico, coordinated through a single railroad holding company that used the Western Valley Railroad as one of several instruments. The fraudulent survey method Caldwell had pioneered in Tarrant County had been replicated with variations in 11 other counties across those territories. 47 families total. Aldridge wrote, "The Federal Land Office is assembling a dedicated task force to handle the full scope of the restoration proceedings. I have been asked to lead it. I am asking you to come to Denver after your bar examination and join this work as a federal associate. This is not a courtesy offer. We need someone who understands this specific kind of fraud from the inside, who has built the case against it, who has testified to its mechanics, who knows exactly how it was designed to look legitimate. There is no one better qualified." 47 families. Maribel sat at the kitchen table and read that number until it stopped being a number and became what it actually was. 47 kitchens. 47 front doors. 47 mornings before sunrise, when men with leather satchels came to announce that everything was already decided. She set the letter down. She pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed through what she was feeling, which was large and complicated, and had her father's face in it. Somehow, his patience, his belief, the specific quality of his voice, when he said the law protects the person who knows it. She picked up her pen. She wrote back to Aldridge that evening. 3 sentences. I will pass the bar examination. I will come to Denver. Tell the 47 families someone is coming. She passed the bar examination in March. She went to Denver alone for the testing 3 days written examination, followed by an oral review before a panel of 3 federal judges. She stayed in a boarding house 2 blocks from the examination hall and studied each evening until the candle burned low and slept 6 hours and woke before sunrise and read for 2 more hours before she walked to the hall. The oral review was the hardest part. The 3 judges questioned her for 90 minutes on federal procedure, territorial jurisdiction, evidence standards, contract law, the specific provisions governing land titles in the Colorado Territory. They were not unkind. They were thorough. They asked follow-up questions on her answers and follow-up questions on those. When it was over, she walked out of that hall and stood on the street and breathed the cold March air and didn't know for 3 days what the result was, because that was how long it took them to post the list. She was at the Federal Land Office meeting with Aldridge. When Walter Grayson arrived in Denver, he had ridden 3 days to be there for the posting and came through the office door with his hat in his hand and his face doing something she had never seen it do before. "Well," she said. "You passed," he said. She sat very still for a moment. "First attempt," Walter said. 14th overall score in the territory." He stopped. He looked at her with those old, careful eyes that had seen 23 years of frontier law and had learned not to display what they felt, except in the moments when it couldn't be helped. Thomas Hartwell would have been... He stopped again. His jaw worked once. "He would have been absolutely insufferable about this," he said. "He would have told everyone in 3 counties." Maribel laughed. It came out sudden and real and full, the kind of laugh that doesn't ask permission, and it filled that Denver office for a moment, and then settled, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and felt her eyes sting, and didn't apologize for either. "Yes, he would have," she said. Clara came to Denver for the formal admission to the bar. She took the 3-day wagon ride alone, and arrived the afternoon before the ceremony, and came into Aldridge's office where Maribel was working, and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of her daughter at a desk surrounded by case files with a federal law office letterhead on everything. "Well," Clara said. "Mama," Maribel said, standing. Clara crossed the room and took her daughter's face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment, the way she had looked at her in the kitchen doorway that first morning, the morning before sunrise when the knock came and everything began. The same face, the same daughter. Something new behind it that had always been there, but was fully visible now, fully real, fully its own. Your father would have walked into this office, Clara said, and he would have picked up every single file on that desk and asked you to explain each one, and he would not have left until you had. I know, Maribel said. He would have loved every minute of it, Clara said. I know that too, Maribel said. Clara let go of her face and stepped back and straightened her coat and looked around the office with the direct practical gaze she brought to everything. Show me what you're working on, she said. So Maribel showed her. They sat together in that Denver office for 2 hours, while Maribel walked her mother through the 47 cases, the families, the counties, the evidence chains, the restoration process, what had already been done, and what still needed doing. Clara listened with the same focused attention she had brought to the kitchen table 6 months ago, the same attention she had brought to everything that mattered. When Maribel finished, Clara sat back. 47, she said. 47, Maribel said. And Caldwell. Sentenced last month, 12 years federal prison. Maribel kept her voice even. The railroad holding company is under federal receivership. 11 of their regional officers are under indictment. Clara nodded slowly. And Vail. Disbarred, Maribel said. He won't practice law again. Clara folded her hands in her lap, looked at the desk, looked at the files, looked at her daughter. All right, she said quietly. Something in her voice had the quality of a door closing gently on a long and painful chapter. Not erasing it, just closing it. All right, then you do the work. I'm already doing it, Maribel said. The formal admission ceremony was the following morning in the federal courthouse, the same building where the Caldwell ruling had come down 4 months earlier. Maribel stood before the presiding federal judge in the dark gray wool dress she had bought for the Denver testimony, and raised her right hand and spoke the oath in a clear and steady voice. Catherine Aldridge stood to her left. Walter Grayson stood to her right, his hat in his hands and his posture the straightest she had ever seen it. Clara sat in the front row of the gallery and held her hands folded in her lap and watched her daughter with a face that was simply fully entirely proud. When the oath was finished, the judge shook Maribel's hand. Miss Hartwell, he said, the Colorado Territory is fortunate to have you. Thank you, Your Honor, she said. I intend to make good use of it. She walked back to her seat and sat down beside Walter and Clara, and the ceremony continued around her, and she sat in the quiet of that large formal room and thought about a kitchen table in Red Hollow, and a stack of old law books on a shelf above a fireplace, and a man who had believed all the way to the end of his life that his daughter was going to need to know these things. He had been right. He had always been right. They went home to Red Hollow one last time before Maribel's federal work began in earnest. 3 days at the ranch. She fixed the south fence line with Clara and cooked proper meals and slept in her own bed and walked the land in the early mornings, the way she used to walk it with her father, slow and deliberate, knowing every foot of it. On the last evening, she sat on the porch as the light went long and amber across the valley, and Walter Grayson pulled up in his wagon and climbed down and came and sat in the other chair. They sat without talking for a while. The valley was quiet. The land stretched wide and open under the late light. You know what I keep thinking about, Maribel said. What? The morning Marsh came to the door, before sunrise, the knock. She looked at the road. I almost didn't open it. Walter looked at her. But you did. I did. She was quiet for a moment. And then every door after that. Cassidy's door, Whitaker's door, the courthouse door, the federal office door. Every one of them I stood outside of for a moment and thought about what was on the other side and what it was going to cost me to walk through. And you walked through every one, Walter said. Yes, she said. Because, she thought about it honestly. Because my father taught me that the law doesn't protect anyone by itself, she said. Someone has to carry it. Someone has to walk into the rooms where it's being broken and hold it up and refuse to put it down. She looked at the land. Her father had loved. The land they had fought for, the land that was theirs now, in a way that had been earned and proven and could not be taken back. And because there was nobody else. Walter was quiet for a moment. "There will be now," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley with the expression of a man at the end of a long career, looking at a thing he had always hoped for and had not always expected to see. "Every case you take," he said. "Every family you stand in front of a courtroom for. Every door you walk through. You won't be the only one anymore. You'll be the one who showed the next person it was possible." She held that. Let it settle into her. The way real things settle, not fast, not loud, but deep. The way water finds the lowest place and stays. She thought about Eleanor Marsh's 12-year-old daughter who wanted to be a doctor. She thought about the letter she had written her. She thought about all the doors she hadn't known existed yet in all the counties across 3 territories where 47 families were waiting, and all the doors beyond those. She thought about her father's voice. The law protects the person who knows it. She thought about what she knew now, sitting on this porch, looking at this valley on the other side of everything she had walked through. She knew more than the law. She knew what it cost to carry it. She knew that the cost was worth it. She knew that she was going to keep paying it one door at a time, one family at a time, one courtroom at a time, for as long as she had the strength to stand. The sun went down over Red Hollow, Colorado. Maribel Hartwell sat on her father's porch and watched it go. And when the last of the light left the sky, she stood up and she went inside and she got back to work. Because that was who she was. That was who she